How will the Southeastern Conference reorganize its scheduling for football after the addition of Oklahoma and Texas? Will the SEC follow the growing trend in other conferences of eliminating divisions? That would serve the expanded SEC as an improvement. In the current divisional format, some members only face others in the opposite division once per decade. Should members of the same conference not play each other more often than that? If the SEC would decide to keep a divisional format, how would the teams be divided? Assuming that Texas and Oklahoma would be assigned to the Western Division, one team from the West would have to shift to the Eastern Division. Of all of the current Western Division members, Auburn is the farthest east. Should that equate to Auburn moving to the other division? In that case, the SEC would have to continue the practice of one permanent cross-divisional opponent. Otherwise, the annual meeting with Alabama would have to end. That change would cause an overwhelming uproar, forcing Alabama to end its longtime series with Tennessee. Therefore, both Alabama and Auburn would have to switch to the Eastern Division, with Missouri moving westward where it rightfully belongs. However, that raises the question whether permanent crossover opponents would be implemented. Some border state series, such as Alabama versus Mississippi State, Kentucky versus Missouri, and Arkansas versus Tennessee, could be justified. However, several members of both divisions would not border any other state with a member in the opposite division. The SEC already has cross-divisional series involving members who do not share a border, such as Florida versus LSU, Kentucky versus Mississippi State, and South Carolina versus Texas A&M. Why add more such series? The addition of any more permanent series between members in non-bordering states would just perpetuate the strange geographic situation that already exists in the SEC. Missouri's campus is further west than 5 members of the SEC East, yet Missouri is located in the SEC East. Assuming that the divisions will be scrapped, how should the schedule be set? First of all in-state rivalries will have to be scheduled annually. Those include Alabama versus Auburn, Ole Miss versus Mississippi State, Tennessee versus Vanderbilt, Texas versus Texas A&M. Secondly, some longtime border state battles must be considered. Alabama versus Mississippi State first played in 1896 with 106 meetings and have played every year starting since 1948. Alabama versus Tennessee first played in 1901 with 104 meetings, played every year starting in 1944. Auburn versus Georgia first played in 1892 with 126 meetings, having played each other every year starting in 1944. Other long-running series, such as Florida versus Georgia, first played in 1915 with 99 meetings and having played each other every year starting in the year 1944. Kentucky versus Tennessee first played in 1893 with 117 meetings, having been played every year since 1944. LSU versus Ole Miss first played in 1894 with 110 meetings, played every year starting in 1945. And other long-running series involving border state rivals, LSU versus Mississippi State first played in 1896 with 115 meetings, played every year since 1944. And finally, Oklahoma versus Texas first played in 1900 with 117 meetings, having played every year starting in the year 1929. With those series in mind, some of the 16 members of the expanded SEC would already have their 3 permanent opponents determined. Alabama would face Auburn, Mississippi State, and Tennessee every year. Mississippi State would face Alabama, LSU, and Ole Miss every year. Tennessee would face Alabama, Kentucky, and Vanderbilt. Another factor in choosing permanent opponents is the restoration of long-time series that were interrupted due to previous conference realignment. These include Arkansas versus Texas, first played in 1894, having played each other 79 times, and played each other every season from 1932 through 1991, when Arkansas left the Southwest Conference to join the SEC. Also, Missouri versus Oklahoma, first played in 1902 with 96 meetings, that was played every year from 1919 through 2011, when Missouri left the Big 12 to join the SEC. The resumption of those terminated annual series means that one more member has its three permanent opponents decided. Texas would face Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Texas A&M on an annual basis. So how should the remaining permanent opponents be assigned? Members in bordering states should be matched if possible. The process should start with the members of the periphery of the expanded footprint. Missouri, as the northernmost member, only borders four other SEC states. Therefore, Missouri should be assigned with its neighbor to the south, Arkansas, and its neighbor to the east, Kentucky, who is also on the northern edge of the footprint. Oklahoma, on the western side of the SEC's territory, has already been assigned Missouri and Texas. Who should be the third, considering that Arkansas and Texas A&M are in neighboring states? With distance in mind, Arkansas would be the third permanent opponent, since Norman is closer to Fayetteville than it is to College Station. With Arkansas versus Oklahoma set up as an annual matchup, Arkansas has its third annual opponent. Georgia would continue its two long-time border wars with Auburn and Florida. So which other member should serve as Georgia's third permanent opponent? Considering that the only other state that South Carolina borders is Georgia, it makes sense to pair those two. Kentucky has been tied to Missouri and Tennessee. The only other SEC program in a neighboring state is Vanderbilt. Therefore, Kentucky has its third permanent opponent. Auburn has already been assigned Alabama and Georgia. The only other state bordering Florida is Alabama. Since Alabama already has its three permanent opponents, that leaves Auburn available to match with Florida. After these decisions, the following programs would have their permanent opponents determined. Arkansas would face Missouri, Oklahoma, and Texas. Auburn would face Alabama, Florida, and Georgia. Georgia would face Auburn, Florida, and South Carolina. So far in this proposal, Kentucky has been tied to Missouri and Tennessee. The only other SEC member in a neighboring state is Vanderbilt. Therefore, Kentucky will have Vanderbilt as its third permanent opponents. So who does not have three permanent opponents set yet? So with which opponents have those previously mentioned teams already been assigned? Florida has been matched with Auburn and Georgia. South Carolina matched with Georgia. Vanderbilt matched with Kentucky and Tennessee. So that South Carolina has now been assigned to Georgia as a permanent opponent, who are the other options for the two remaining permanent opponents? Florida, LSU, Ole Miss, Texas A&M, or Vanderbilt. South Carolina is located in the northeastern corner of the SEC's territory. So other than the obvious connection with Georgia, with whom should South Carolina be matched? The closest of the remaining members without three permanent opponents yet are Florida and Vanderbilt. Therefore, those two will be assigned to South Carolina. Therefore, permanent opponents now have been determined for Florida, who will face Auburn, Georgia, and South Carolina. South Carolina will face Florida, Georgia, and Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt will face Kentucky, South Carolina, and Tennessee. As for the final three members, LSU, Ole Miss, and Texas A&M, who do not yet have three permanent opponents assigned to them, Both LSU and Ole Miss would play Mississippi State annually in addition to facing each other. Accordingly, LSU and Ole Miss would need one more permanent opponent. Meanwhile, Texas A&M still needs two more. As a result, Texas A&M would be matched with both LSU and Ole Miss on a yearly basis. With every member having been assigned 3 permanent opponents, the next question is how to decide on rotating opponents. The most entertaining approach is to allow for more frequently recurring matchups. That would involve each member facing a slate of 6 rotating opponents that would change in alternating seasons. 3 would be at home and 3 would on the road. The following season, those home games would be on the road, and those which were road games would be home dates. In that way, every SEC member would play all other 15 members at least once on the road and once at home in a 4-year span. What do you think? Leave comments or questions, and do not forget to subscribe for more upcoming videos.